So imagine you're at a crowded dinner party, right? You've got a drink in your hand, you're looking around, and a stranger walks up. They smile, they extend a hand, and they ask you the inevitable question.
Oh, I know exactly what's coming.
Yeah, you know it. So what do? It's the absolute #1 topic of conversation when you meet a stranger. But okay, here's the thought experiment. Imagine that you are legally forbidden, like under penalty of law, from answering with your job title.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. You cannot say you are an accountant. You cannot say you're a teacher or a software engineer or a barista or whatever. You have to explain who you are to this person without relying on the economic shorthand of your labor. Who are you in that exact moment? How do you even begin to answer that?
I mean, honestly, it creates an immediate, almost suffocating sense of panic for most people.
Right. I felt it just saying it.
Yeah, and that panic is incredibly revealing because we realize in that hypothetical silence that we don't actually know how to separate our human identity from our economic utility.
Exactly. And that exact tension is what we are tearing down today in this deep dive.
It's such a massive topic.
It really is. We are looking at this fascinating linguistic roadmap from our source material that basically maps out the entire philosophy of modern labor.
Right.
We're going to track how the language we use to describe our work evolves. So starting from those basic foundational statements of identity that we just stripped away at our imaginary dinner party, all the way up to these incredibly complex macroeconomic theories about the future of humanity itself.
And what becomes immediately apparent when you dive into this progression, looking at the sources, is that language naturally scales to match the depth and the gravity of our thoughts.
Yeah, that makes sense.
As our understanding of our place in the workforce becomes more nuanced and more complicated, and honestly, undeniably more precarious, the vocabulary we use just has to adapt. It has to carry a much heavier conceptual weight.
So it's not just grammar.
Oh, not at all. How we talk about work isn't just about grammar. It fundamentally reflects our societal relationship with labor and, well, with capitalism as a whole.
I was looking at this progression in the source material, and it reminds me so much of a video game skill tree.
Oh, I love that analogy.
Yeah, like think about when you start a new game. You're at level 1, you have maybe 2 or 3 basic moves just to navigate the immediate environment, right? You can walk, you can jump.
Right, just the absolute basics.
Exactly. And in linguistic terms, this is what the source calls the A2 level. It's just simple nouns and prepositions to figure out where you're standing. But as you gain experience, you level up. Your conceptual framework expands.
You unlock new abilities.
Exactly. You unlock the dynamic movements of the B1 level, and then you unlock this deep, sometimes really dark psychological analysis at the B2 level.
Until you eventually reach the end game.
Right, the C1 and C2 levels. You are unlocking reality-bending, high-level magic, where you're suddenly debating the gig economy and the automation of human thought, and literally the intrinsic value of life itself.
This is a perfect visualization, honestly, because, what does it mean to level up in a language?
Right.
It means moving from describing your immediate physical reality to describing abstract, systemic realities. We start with the literal mechanics of the individual worker, and we end up having to describe the invisible architecture of the entire global economy.
It's wild how fast it scales.
It really is. But before we can philosophize about, the future of work and artificial intelligence, we have to start at the foundation.
Back to level 1.
Back to level 1. We have to look at how we construct that basic professional identity for the rest of the world.
Okay, so level 1, the foundation. The source points out this really common trap that people fall into right out of the gate when establishing this identity. We can call it the preposition trap.
Yes, this is so common.
The core concept here is the absolute necessity of moving beyond simplistic noun statements. When that stranger at the dinner party asks what you do, the immediate human instinct is to just plant a flag in the ground and say, I am a teacher, or, I am an engineer.
And we have to stop and interrogate why we do that. I am is an ontological statement.
Wait, ontological. Break that down for everyone.
Sure, it means it's a statement of fundamental being. When you say, I am a teacher, you are basically equating your entire human existence, like your soul, your personality, your worth, with your labor output.
Wow, yeah, that's heavy.
You aren't saying teaching is an activity I perform for currency. You're saying teaching is the totality of my identity.
Which is incredibly dangerous when you actually stop and think about it. If you are your job, what happens when you lose it? Do you just cease to exist?
Exactly. That's where the panic comes from in your dinner party scenario.
Right. So to accurately define our place in the workforce without, losing our humanity in the process, the source says we have to introduce some distance. We need to use specific prepositions.
Yes, we have to move away from I am.
Right, and start utilizing phrases like work as, work in, and work for.
And the psychological and sociological differences between those three phrases are absolutely critical. They aren't just synonyms,
Yeah.
They do entirely different jobs in a sentence.
Walk us through them.
Let's break them down. First, you have work as. This is used to name your specific profession or your function. For example, I work as a graphic designer, or I work as an office manager.
I love this one because notice how that tiny word as creates a buffer.
A psychological buffer, exactly.
Since I am a graphic designer, feels permanent, like it's baked into your cellular structure. But I work as a graphic designer implies a role. It's like the professional hat you put on when you clock in, and crucially, it's a hat you can take off when you go home.
Precisely. It acknowledges the performance of labor without surrendering your whole self to it. Then we have the second phrase, which shifts the focus entirely, and that's work in.
Right.
You use work in to name the broader field, the industry, or the ecosystem you belong to. Like you would never say, I work in graphic designer.
No, that sounds ridiculous.
Right. You would say, I work in marketing, or I work in finance, or I work in education.
So work as is the specific job, and work in is the massive industry umbrella.
Exactly. And then we have the third preposition, which is work for. And this one is entirely about allegiance.
Allegiance, I like that word for this.
Yeah, work for identifies the employer, the corporation, or the entity that holds the capital and actually signs your paycheck.
Yeah.
So I work for a multinational tech company, or I work for a small independent agency in the city center.
It's so interesting. If you put all three of these together, it's basically like giving someone your exact GPS coordinates on an economic map.
That's a great way to look at it.
Yeah, like work as is the specific vehicle you're driving. It's your tool set, your daily function. Work in is the terrain you are navigating, so the broad landscape of your industry. And work for is the flag you fly on the antenna. It's the specific sovereign organization you have sworn your professional allegiance to for 40 hours a week.
That coordinate analogy is exactly why this precision matters so much. Because if you only give one piece of information, you leave people entirely lost on the map.
How so?
Well, if you simply tell someone I work in finance, the terrain is clear, but the vehicle is a total mystery.
Oh, I see.
That phrase could mean you're a high-powered investment banker making millions on Wall Street, or it could mean you're the overnight security guard at a local credit union.
Wow, yeah. The terrain is identical, but the day-to-day reality is worlds apart.
Totally different. Your actual experience of the workforce is completely different.
And to finish mapping those coordinates, the source material also gives us a specific formula for describing the actual daily duties.
Right, the mechanics of the job.
Yeah. So once you've established the vehicle, the terrain, and the flag, you explain the mechanics of your day using the phrase responsible for, followed by either an ing verb or a noun, like, I am responsible for managing client accounts, or I am responsible for the server maintenance.
And again, notice the framing there.
Yeah.
Responsible for implies agency and duty, but it still maintains that healthy distance we talked about.
It's not, I am the server maintenance.
Exactly. It outlines the parameters of a contract between you and the employer. And this foundational accuracy is so important because when you are navigating a networking event, these basic phrases establish your professional boundaries cleanly.
They build a safe structure.
They build an accurate architecture of who you are within the economic system without requiring you to sacrifice your entire human identity to an I am statement.
Okay, so that's a solid foundation. You know exactly where you stand. But human beings rarely like to stay still, right? No. Once we establish where we are, the immediate instinct is to figure out how to move. Careers are not static monuments. They are dynamic, they move up, they move down, sideways, and, well, sometimes they crash completely.
Very true.
And to describe that volatile movement, we have to level up to the B1 tier of our conceptual skill tree. This is the mechanics of mobility and loss.
This is a major transition in the language. We are moving from the static prepositions of identity to the dynamic, action-oriented world of phrasal verbs.
Phrasal verbs.
Yeah, they serve as the internal combustion engine of career movement. We need them because the processes of hiring, leaving, and losing employment are mechanically complex and, honestly, incredibly emotionally charged.
Let's start with the inward movement, getting your foot in the door. There is a common linguistic misstep here that the source points out.
A very common one, yes.
When you want a job, you don't just give an application to a company. You don't give a resume. The phrasal verb we use is to apply for. You apply for a management position. You apply for the fellowship.
The distinction there reveals the underlying power dynamic.
How do you mean?
Well, giving implies a lateral, equal transaction. You give a friend a cup of coffee. You give a cashier $5. But applying for implies making a formal, structured request for consideration to an entity that holds power over you.
Ah, I see.
It inherently acknowledges that there is a gatekeeper. You are standing outside the wall, submitting paperwork, and basically asking for permission to enter.
And if that gatekeeper approves of you, if you make it through the whole gauntlet of interviews, the company will take you on. You'll hear things like, the firm is taking on 50 new staff members this quarter.
I want you to think about the physical, almost visceral imagery of that phrase. Take on.
Yeah, it sounds heavy.
It does. To take something on implies absorbing weight, assuming a burden, or accepting a new responsibility. When a company takes you on, they're essentially pulling you over the wall and bringing you into their collective fold.
Like a tribe.
Very much like a tribe. They are assuming the financial burden of your livelihood in exchange for the extraction of your labor. Despite the transactional nature of it, the language itself has a very communal, almost protective resonance to it.
But of course, the door swings both ways. People leave. Let's look at the outward movement, specifically when you are the one choosing to open the door and walk out.
The voluntary exit.
Right. Say you are deeply unhappy or the workload is just destroying your mental health. The formal HR-approved word is resign. But in actual conversation, we use the phrase step down, like the exhausted CEO decided to step down.
Step down is a brilliant spatial metaphor.
I love how visual these are.
They really are. Notice what it implies about how we view employment. It implies that holding a job, especially a really demanding or prestigious one, elevates you. It places you on a pedestal, on a higher platform above the fray.
So you're literally up high.
Yes. Leaving that job isn't just walking away horizontally. It is a conscious, deliberate descent. You are relinquishing altitude, status, and authority, usually in exchange for relief or just peace of mind.
It's a very controlled movement. You are carefully stepping down the stairs. But what about the involuntary outward movement? What happens when the stairs just completely collapse underneath you?
That's where the vocabulary gets harsh.
Yeah, we have to look at the phrase laid off. And I want to be incredibly precise here because people often conflate being laid off with being fired, and they are completely different realities.
It is arguably one of the most important emotional and linguistic distinctions in the modern working world. The psychological impact of the two terms couldn't be more divergent.
Exactly. Being fired means you failed the company.
Right.
You broke a rule, you violated a policy, or your performance was just consistently terrible. It is a punitive action based on your individual behavior. I like to think of it as getting a red card for breaking the rules of the game.
That's a good analogy.
But being laid off, that means the company failed you. It's like the team owner suddenly going bankrupt and selling the stadium while you're still on the field. You could be the highest performing employee on the floor, breaking sales records, but if the macroeconomic winds shift and the board of directors mismanages the budget, you are gone.
The distinction is entirely about the locus of control. Being laid off is about the structural finances of the institution, not your personal merit.
Right, it's not your fault.
No. Think of a manufacturing plant cutting, say, 200 workers because the price of raw steel skyrocketed globally. Those workers did nothing wrong. And what is so revealing here is how these phrasal verbs construct a narrative of vulnerability.
The vocabulary practically forces you to accept how little control you actually have.
Yes. Think of the contrast we just discussed. Taking someone on is an active communal choice. It's an embrace. But being laid off is a passive state for the worker.
You don't lay yourself off.
Exactly. It highlights your complete subjugation to macroeconomic forces that you cannot influence. You're severed from the community, stripped of your livelihood, not because you failed the tribe, but because the tribe's leaders ran out of resources. It encodes this profound, lingering anxiety right into our daily vocabulary.
It's terrifying, really, because you can do everything perfectly and still lose.
You really can.
But let's say you avoid all that. Let's say you successfully apply for the job, you get taken on, you never have to step down, and you somehow survive all the rounds of layoffs.
A miracle.
Seriously, you are safely entrenched inside the company walls. Well, take a deep breath, because you are now immediately subjected to the intense, often totally toxic psychological environment of workplace culture.
Which brings us to the B2 level of our conceptual roadmap. The source calls this tier the analyst.
The analyst.
Yes, and this represents a massive shift in how we are utilizing language. We're no longer talking about the literal mechanics of getting a job or leaving a job. We are attempting to analyze and survive the culture of doing the job.
And to capture the sheer intensity of that daily experience, we rely heavily on really vivid idioms. We need idioms to articulate the ambition, the systemic frustration, and honestly, the biological exhaustion of modern corporate life.
They are very powerful linguistic tools.
Let's start with the ambition. The gold standard idiom here, according to the source, is climbing the corporate ladder. Everyone knows this one.
Oh, absolutely.
It represents that fierce determination to work 60, 70, 80-hour weeks, just sacrificing your personal life to reach the executive suite, to become a director or a vice president.
And again, we see the spatial metaphor of altitude representing success. But look closely at the architecture of a ladder.
Okay, a ladder.
A ladder is a strictly vertical climb. It is narrow. Only one person can occupy a rung at a time. It implies a highly structured, rigid path upward where progress is measured exclusively by who is above you and who is below you.
And you have to step over people.
Yes.
Yeah.
It perfectly encapsulates an individualistic, solitary pursuit of status. You aren't lifting a community, you're climbing past them.
But what happens when you are halfway up that ladder, you're putting in the 80-hour weeks, your performance metrics are flawless, and you suddenly slam your head into a barrier that you didn't even know existed?
Yes.
This is where we encounter the idiom of hitting a glass ceiling.
The glass ceiling is a vital sociological concept disguised as a simple idiom. It describes an unacknowledged, invisible barrier to advancement. And it is crucial to understand that this barrier almost exclusively affects the most qualified, capable individuals from marginalized groups, particularly women and minorities.
The operative word there is unacknowledged, right? That's what makes the glass ceiling a form of systemic gaslighting.
Exactly.
Because it isn't a written policy. The employee handbook doesn't literally say you can only be promoted this far. Because the ceiling is made of glass, it's transparent, you can stand on your rung of the ladder and look up, you can clearly see the executive suite, you can see the boardroom, you can see the corner office.
The destination is totally visible.
Right, which gives you hope. But when you actually try to step onto that final rung, this hard, invisible force rejects you.
And that transparency is exactly what makes it so psychologically damaging. It creates an extreme cognitive dissonance.
How so?
Well, the official corporate narrative, the myth of the meritocracy, tells you to keep climbing, work harder. But your lived reality is a hard, impenetrable barrier. Navigating that dissonance, being told the path is clear while repeatedly bruising yourself against an invisible roof, requires a massive amount of psychological endurance.
And what happens when that endurance runs out? What happens to the human body and mind when it is subjected to that kind of friction year after year?
It breaks down.
Exactly. We hit the next concept, burnout. Burnout is defined as the severe emotional, physical, and mental exhaustion caused by excessive, prolonged stress. It's what happens when you climb too fast for too long without a vacation or a reprieve.
And it is so important to separate burnout from ordinary fatigue.
Right. It's not just being tired.
No, burnout is not just needing a nap or a weekend away. It is a total systemic depletion. It is quite literally the pathology of the modern workplace. It's the biological consequence of forcing a human being to operate like an industrial machine within our hostile architecture.
And speaking of hostile architecture, if you zoom out from the ladder and the ceiling, you get the most terrifying idiom of them all to describe the entire ecosystem.
Oh, I know where you're going.
The rat race.
The rat race.
Yeah.
The ultimate symbol of endless competitive struggle.
It is such a visceral, disturbing image. It compares white-collar professionals to literal rodents running frantically inside a maze, chasing a piece of cheese that is always just slightly out of reach.
Round and round.
Yeah, it's a relentless, dizzying loop, which is exactly why it prompts so many people to fantasize about quitting their six-figure jobs, moving to the countryside, and just, opening a bakery.
A sourdough bakery, usually.
Always sourdough. But wait, I actually want to pause and challenge this framework for a second. Looking at the source material, I see a conflict.
Please do. Where do you see the friction?
There is a massive cultural contradiction here. From the time we are in grade school, we are socially conditioned and explicitly encouraged to climb the ladder.
Right, ambition is good.
Ambition is celebrated. It's rewarded with wealth and status. But simultaneously, from the exact same culture, we are constantly warned about the soul-crushing despair of being trapped in the rat race.
Yes.
So aren't these just two cynical ways of looking at the same thing? Is the corporate ladder just a vertical rat race? Like, what if someone genuinely loves their job? Can ambition exist without it being a pathology?
That is a phenomenal pushback, and it gets to the very heart of why these idioms exist in our language.
Yeah.
Can ambition exist healthily? Yes, absolutely. But these idioms don't describe healthy ambition. They describe the structural engineering of modern corporate capitalism.
Okay, explain that.
Let's look at how the spatial metaphors of these three idioms interact,
Right.
because they actually form a complete architectural blueprint of the workplace.
Okay, lay out the blueprint for us.
You're right to connect them. The ladder is a vertical climb. It appeals to our healthy desire for growth and progress, offering the illusion that we can rise above the maze. But for many, the glass ceiling acts as an invisible roof, violently halting that vertical progress.
Right.
And what happens when your upward momentum is completely stopped? You are deflected back down into the rat race, which is a horizontal loop. It's an endless maze of running in circles just to maintain your current position.
Wow. So the system is designed to trap you, regardless of whether you try to move horizontally or vertically.
Precisely. Together, the ladder, the ceiling, and the maze form a claustrophobic, inescapable architecture. You try to climb out, you hit the ceiling, and you fall back into the maze. The ladder isn't an escape from the rat race. It is just a vertical extension of it.
That is wild.
And this perfectly explains why burnout is so prevalent. Burnout isn't a personal failure of resilience. It is the inevitable biological consequence of a human being trying to survive inside an environment that is structurally designed to extract infinite energy from a finite organism.
A claustrophobic architecture designed for infinite extraction. That is incredibly bleak.
It's sobering.
But it makes perfect sense. If the traditional workplace is a maze that inevitably grinds you down into burnout or throws invisible ceilings at you that gaslight you, it is no wonder that the entire traditional structure of employment has begun to fracture entirely.
People want out.
Yeah, people are desperately looking for an exit from the maze.
And that desperation for an exit, or in many cases being forcibly ejected from the maze by macroeconomic forces, pushes us into the modern reality of labor. This is where we reach the absolute summit of our linguistic roadmap. We are entering the C1 and C2 conceptual levels. We are now the philosopher.
We're zooming all the way out to a satellite view here. We are no longer talking about individual jobs. We're looking at how modern work is fundamentally altering what it means to be a human being.
It's a seismic shift.
Because the old 20th century dream, the idea of securing one stable job, staying with that company for 40 years, climbing a predictable ladder, and retiring with a pension, that era is fractured. It's just gone.
It has been entirely replaced by structural macroeconomic shifts that require incredibly advanced, highly theoretical vocabulary to even comprehend, let alone navigate.
Yeah.
The first and most pervasive shift we have to analyze here is the gig economy.
I find the linguistic evolution of the word gig so fascinating here.
It really is.
Decades ago, a gig was something very specific and inherently cool. It was a term used by jazz musicians. You had a gig at a club on Friday night. It implied artistry, independence, and a temporary performance.
It was creative.
Exactly. But today, we have taken that word and we've weaponized it. The gig economy now defines a massive global sector of the labor market characterized entirely by short-term contracts, freelance work, and algorithmic management rather than permanent employment.
We're talking about Uber drivers, delivery riders, freelance copywriters, data annotators, millions of people who have had stable employment replaced by independent contractor status. And what is so insidious about the language of the gig economy is how it masks vulnerability with the rhetoric of empowerment.
Right. The marketing tells you to be your own boss or hustle on your own time. It sells the illusion of escaping the 9-to-5 rat race.
But a high-level macroeconomic analysis reveals that for the vast majority of workers, it isn't an escape, it's an exile.
An exile. Wow.
It is the complete removal of the safety net. Which brings us to a very heavy, critical vocabulary word, precarity.
Precarity, or precarious employment. This isn't just about having a bad day at the office.
Oh.
This is work that is fundamentally intentionally insecure and unpredictable. It's labor that has been systematically stripped of all the stabilizing benefits that used to define a career. No health insurance, no paid sick leave, no guaranteed minimum hours, no retirement.
Economists and sociologists actually argue that precarity has generated an entirely new, global social class.
The precariat.
Yes, the precariat. We've moved from a 20th century society defined by a working class with stable, albeit physically difficult, jobs, to a 21st century precariat class that is constantly hovering on the absolute edge of financial ruin.
Just scraping by.
Exactly. These are people who have to juggle 3 different apps, working 14-hour days, just to patch together enough micropayments to pay rent.
And the psychological consequences of living in a constant state of precarity are devastating. It completely changes how you view yourself and your community. To explain this, the source looks at a concept that traces its roots all the way back to the 19th century, the alienation of labor.
Now, it's fascinating because this traces directly back to frameworks established by Karl Marx.
Yes, and I want to pause here for a second for a quick rule check.
Of course.
Just to be totally clear to you, the listener, both of us are merely reporting on this concept exactly as it's presented in the source text to analyze the language. We are not taking any political sides or endorsing Marxist ideology here.
Absolutely. Regardless of where you fall on the political spectrum, whether you view his broader economic theories as revolutionary or you view them as disastrous and historically flawed, this specific sociological observation about how human beings interact with the tools and products of their labor is incredibly useful for diagnosing the psychological reality of today's gig economy.
It is a perfect lens for understanding the modern worker. So looking at the concept strictly as an analytical tool, the alienation of labor describes a specific, multi-layered psychological severance.
Okay.
In the context of the modern gig economy, it happens when workers are reduced to fulfilling tiny, fragmented, disconnected tasks on digital apps. And this fragmentation causes them to become fundamentally disconnected from 3 vital things.
The first disconnection is from the final product itself.
How so?
Well, if you are a traditional craftsman, say a carpenter building a chair, you see the project from the raw wood all the way to the finished piece. You feel pride in the completion.
You made that.
Exactly. But in the gig economy, if you are a temporary contractor writing one single line of code for a massive logistics app or driving one single meal across town, you have no ownership or connection to the larger enterprise. You're just a tiny, replaceable gear turning in the dark.
The second disconnection is from the employer. In traditional work, even if your boss was a total jerk, they were a human being.
They got a face.
Yeah, you could look them in the eye, you could argue with them, you could negotiate. But in the gig economy, your boss is often an algorithm. It's a faceless piece of software, a digital panopticon that tracks your location, dictates your routes, and dynamically adjusts your pay based on supply and demand.
There is no human relationship, no empathy, and literally no one to appeal to if something goes wrong.
And that leads to the third and arguably most tragic disconnection. Workers become alienated from their own identity and their fellow workers.
Yes, when you are isolated in your car, competing against invisible algorithms for scraps of work, you cannot build solidarity. You aren't building a craft and you aren't building a community. You're just a data node.
Which transitions us perfectly into the next major linguistic distinction we have to analyze from the source. The tragic shift in how we categorize work itself, moving from a vocation to something purely transactional.
This is a beautiful, yet deeply sorrowful linguistic pairing. Let's look at the word vocation. A vocation is a calling.
It sounds almost religious.
It does, because it derives from the Latin word for voice. It implies that you are being called to do something because you believe in it, because it aligns with your internal moral compass and provides a profound sense of purpose. Teaching, nursing, art, social work, these are traditionally viewed as vocations.
You do a vocation because it feeds your soul and the paycheck is what allows you to keep doing it.
Exactly.
But when work is subjected to the crushing precarity of the gig economy and the deep psychological alienation of labor, it is stripped of its soul. It becomes purely transactional.
Transactional work is done exclusively for the currency. There is no deeper meaning, no institutional loyalty, no higher calling. It is a cold, unfeeling, immediate exchange of your finite biological time for enough cash to survive the precarity of the week.
And just as we as a society are grappling with this massive destabilizing shift from vocation to transaction, we have to confront the ultimate disruptor, the absolute elephant in the room that threatens to upend everything we've talked about today.
Oh, yes.
Artificial intelligence.
Yes, we have to talk about AI, because it fundamentally changes the nature of the threat to human labor.
How is it different from before?
Well, historically, automation was purely a physical threat. During the Industrial Revolution, machines took over the physical labor in factories and farming. A steam-powered tractor replaces 100 men swinging scythes in a field. A robotic arm replaces a human welder on an assembly line.
Right, muscle replacement.
But the modern threat is categorically different. We are facing what economists call the automation of cognitive labor.
The automation of cognitive labor. That phrase should literally send a chill down the spine of anyone listening.
It is terrifying.
AI isn't just taking over lifting heavy boxes in a warehouse. It is taking over thinking. It is taking over writing, coding, synthesizing data, generating art, diagnosing diseases, and analyzing legal briefs.
All the brain work.
Yeah. It's coming for the very skills that the white-collar knowledge economy, the people who always thought they were safe from the factory robots, rely on to justify their place on the corporate ladder.
It is a truly paradigm-shifting concept. It forces us to ask a really dark question. If a machine can think faster, analyze better, and generate content cheaper than a human being, what is the economic value of the human mind?
I have to pause for a second and express my absolute awe at the sheer escalation of this conversation.
It escalated quickly.
I mean, think about where we started. We started this deep dive learning how to say I work in marketing, so we didn't sound awkward holding a cocktail at a networking event. And now we are legitimately questioning the intrinsic value of human existence in the face of hyper-intelligent thinking machines. It's like realizing that the grueling corporate ladder we've been exhausting ourselves climbing for decades is actually leaning against a building that AI is currently tearing down with a wrecking ball.
It is a dizzying escalation, but that is exactly the scale of the philosophical crisis we are currently facing as a species. We are squeezed in a vice between two massive forces. On one side, we have the crushing day-to-day precarity of the gig economy, where human labor is fragmented and devalued into transactional micro-tasks. And on the other side, we have the rapid, breathtaking automation of our cognitive abilities, where AI threatens to render our highest-level skills economically obsolete.
So what is the conclusion here? Where does this C2 linguistic roadmap actually leave us? If the maze is collapsing and the ladder is gone, what is the next paradigm?
The source points us to an ultimate critical historical juncture, a point of total systemic redesign. The key vocabulary phrase we must introduce here is that society must figure out how to decouple human value from economic output.
Decouple human value from economic output. That is a massive, revolutionary phrase. Unpack the mechanics of that for us.
It is the only logical endpoint when work ceases to be a meaningful vocation and cognitive labor is entirely automated. For centuries, spanning multiple economic systems, our fundamental worth as human beings has been inherently tied to what we produce, to the job title we hold, to the wages we earn. I am what I do.
Like we said at the very beginning.
Exactly. But if AI does everything efficiently, and the only remaining human jobs are precarious, transactional, soul-crushing gigs, that equation breaks completely. We can no longer tie human dignity to labor.
And one of the major systemic solutions being debated to facilitate this reality is universal basic income, or UBI.
Exactly. UBI is presented not just as an economic policy, but as a structural mechanism to facilitate this profound philosophical shift. If a society provides a baseline, unconditional income to every citizen, regardless of their employment status, you are physically and legally enacting that decoupling.
You are literally severing the cord between survival and labor.
Yes. You are saying, codified in law and economics, that a human being's worth is intrinsic. You matter simply because you exist. Your right to food, shelter, and dignity is not dictated by your ability to hold a traditional job in an economy that no longer needs your cognitive or physical labor.
That's a beautiful thought.
It's a profound realization that our value exists entirely independently of our economic utility.
Okay. Wow. Let's take a deep breath.
Yeah, that was a lot.
Let's recap the immense, staggering mountain we have climbed today, because we have covered an incredible amount of conceptual ground.
We truly have. It's a comprehensive view of the human condition through the lens of labor.
We started down at the foundation, at the A2 level. We learned how to protect our human identity by moving beyond simple I am nouns, utilizing precise prepositions, work as, work in, work for, to establish our professional coordinates without surrendering our souls to capitalism.
Then we unlocked the B1 level, mastering the dynamic, often turbulent phrasal verbs of career mobility. We explored the power dynamics of applying for roles, the communal embrace of being taken on, the strategic elevated retreat of stepping down. and the uncontrollable macroeconomic vulnerability of being laid off versus the personal failure of being fired.
Right, and from there, we entered the claustrophobic architecture of B2 workplace culture. We analyzed the exhausting reality of trying to climb the vertical individualistic corporate ladder, the systemic gaslighting of hitting the invisible glass ceiling, and the despair of running endlessly in the horizontal rat race.
All of which inevitably grind the human body down into the biological pathology of burnout.
Exactly. And finally, we ascended to the C1 and C2 philosophical summit. We analyzed the modern macroeconomic shifts, the weaponization of language in the gig economy, and the rise of the precariat class.
We examined the 19th century concept of the alienation of labor applied to digital algorithms, where work shifts from a meaningful vocation to a desperate, unfeeling transaction.
And we confronted the existential threat of AI automating human thought, leading us to the ultimate necessary conclusion that we must fundamentally decouple human value from economic output.
It's a wild, incredible journey, and it proves the core point that we started with. True fluency in any subject and in any language is simply the ability to scale your vocabulary to match the profound depth of your thoughts.
You have to have the right words.
You do. You have to have the right words to accurately describe the complex, often terrifying reality you're living in.
Absolutely. Language is the tool we use to build reality. So, we want to leave you, the listener, with a final lingering question. A thought for you to mull over long after this deep dive ends.
It builds on everything we've deconstructed today.
Imagine a future where AI successfully automates all cognitive and physical labor, and society actually manages to decouple our inherent human dignity from our economic output. In that post-work world, what new vocabulary will we have to invent to answer the question, what do you do, when the concept of doing no longer means working?
Is the ultimate question for the next chapter of human history.
Thanks for diving deep with us today. We'll see you next time. What if the very language you use to describe your vacation is actively destroying the places you visit?
Right. I mean, it sounds like a massive exaggeration, right? Until you actually map out the causal chain.
Yeah, exactly.
We just tend to view language as this, passive reflection of our desires. But the specific words we use to compartmentalize travel, they actually shape our economic behavior in a huge way.
And when you scale that behavior across, billions of people, a seemingly harmless phrase about, getting away transforms into this macroeconomic wrecking ball.
A literal wrecking ball, yeah.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the source material we are looking at today provides a completely unexpected window into this exact phenomenon.
It really does. It's fascinating.
Right. So we are analyzing a transcript from an English language program called the Advanced Learner Studio. It features two instructors, Emma and John, and ostensibly, you and I are just looking at a standard language lesson about travel vocabulary.
Yeah, on the surface, that's exactly what it is. They're just walking students through a linguistic progression.
Right, starting with those really basic A2 foundational words and eventually ending up at C2 advanced terminology.
Exactly. But the mission for this deep dive is to read between those lines.
Yes, because we are going to use this escalating vocabulary as a diagnostic tool. We're going to deconstruct the entire modern travel industry.
Because the language that Emma and John are teaching reveals these profound, honestly, deeply uncomfortable truths about our relationship with mobility.
Oh, absolutely. Mobility, privilege, and, the spaces we briefly occupy.
We're starting with the really simple logistics of just packing a bag. But the trajectory of this vocabulary forces us into a heavy, heavy debate about global economics.
And human displacement, right. Which requires looking closely at how the brain fundamentally separates the concept of travel from the physical reality of it.
Yeah. So the instructors begin by tackling the classic confusion between three core words. You have travel, trip, and journey.
Right. And travel is positioned as the overarching, uncountable concept. It's like this abstract ideal.
Exactly. It's uncountable. But then trip is the countable noun. That's the packaged, finite product you actually purchase.
And then journey is strictly the physical movement from point A to point B.
Which is such a crucial distinction.
Yeah.
And it matters because it dictates where we place our emotional capital.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
Right. Because we romanticize the uncountable concept of travel, that human desire for exploration. We cheerfully purchase the countable trip to a nice beach resort.
But we actively resent the journey.
Yes. We hate it. The source actually uses a role play where John talks about his trip to Italy.
Right, I remember that part. He loves the beach hotel, and he loves the idea of travel, obviously.
But his flight was delayed by 4 hours. So he categorizes the journey as this miserable failure.
He essentially quarantines the physical suffering of movement into this one specific word, journey, so it doesn't, contaminate the broader fantasy of the trip.
It's a very modern psychological coping mechanism when you think about it. We isolate the friction.
I look at it a bit like making a film. Travel is the genre you love, let's say, science fiction.
Okay, I like this.
And the trip is the polished, beautifully edited final cut you watch in a theater with your popcorn.
Right, the final product.
But the journey, that's the messy, stressful, chaotic production phase where, the catering doesn't show up, the cameras break down, everyone is sleep deprived.
Yeah, and the modern tourist only wants to consume the final cut. They don't want to see the mess.
Exactly. But I have to ask you, do we focus too much on the trip and forget that the journey is where actual patience and resilience are tested?
Well, I see the utility in your movie analogy, but I'd honestly push back a little on the idea that the trip is the art.
Oh, how so?
Because historically, the journey was the art. If you look at historical accounts of exploration, there was no guaranteed trip package waiting at the end.
That's a really fair point. There was no resort.
Right. The physical movement across a hostile or unknown landscape was the entire point. The friction of the journey was where the learning, the adaptation, and the actual travel happened.
But modernity has totally inverted this.
Completely. Because we expect a frictionless arrival at a pre-purchased destination, we view the journey as a glitch in the matrix.
Yeah, we want teleportation. We really don't want transportation.
That's perfectly said. We resent the delay because it reminds us that we are physical bodies moving through a physical world.
Subject to weather and mechanics.
Exactly. Rather than just being consumers receiving a product we paid for.
And that consumer mindset, it's just hardwired into the essential action verb the instructors highlight for this foundational stage.
Right, the A2 vocabulary.
Yeah, because to initiate the trip, we don't just spontaneously wander out the door. Emma points out that we book a flight or a hotel.
And the etymology of that is so revealing. To enter your name into a book, like a ledger.
You are signing a contract. You are locking yourself into the rigid algorithmic infrastructure of the global tourism industry.
Which is a massive philosophical contradiction here, if you think about it.
Oh, huge. You are initiating this deeply personal, romanticized quest for freedom and escape.
But the very first action you take is to insert yourself into a massive bureaucratic machine.
Exactly. It's so ironic, but once you are codified in that ledger, the static planning ends, and the physical momentum just kind of takes over.
Right, and the vocabulary immediately shifts to match that. We move from abstract nouns into highly dynamic phrasal verbs.
The language becomes totally kinetic. The source outlines phrases like setting off to begin the movement.
And stopping over to pause in transit.
Right. Or looking around once you finally arrive.
But the psychological driver behind all this momentum is the phrase get away.
Yes, getting away. The instructors explicitly define this as escaping daily stress.
Emma actually talks about setting off for the mountains on a Friday evening, specifically because the city work week was just overwhelming.
It frames it all entirely as an act of desperation. The kinetic energy isn't drawn toward a destination, it's repelled by the origin point.
Getting away implies a structural failure in the traveler's day-to-day existence.
So what does this all mean, for the places we visit?
Well, it's a profound shift in utility.
If our primary motivation is based on negative space, running away from a toxic office culture, running away from chronic burnout, are we even capable of engaging meaningfully with a new destination?
That is the big question. It feels like we are using entire countries simply as pressure release valves for late-stage capitalism.
Yeah, we aren't going to the mountains to experience the mountains. We are going to the mountains to simply not be at our desks.
What's fascinating here is that framing reduces the host destination to a therapeutic tool for the stressed worker.
Backdrop.
Exactly. If the goal is simply distance from the self, the specifics of the local culture become irrelevant. You just need a backdrop that isn't your office.
But the kinetic energy of getting away eventually has to dissipate, right? You can't stay in transit forever.
Right. You arrive, you unpack, and the distraction of movement just stops.
And the brain is suddenly forced to process the new environment. The exhaustion of the commute is over, and the internal shift begins.
This is where the instructors level up the language. They label as the analyst level of vocabulary.
The B2 level. where travel morphs from logistical movement into deep psychological transformation.
Yes, and this is where we encounter the concept of broadening your horizons, which is often treated as a cliche.
Oh, totally. A total cliche.
But if you look at the mechanics of it, a horizon is the literal limit of what you can perceive from your current coordinate.
Right, physically and mentally.
So to broaden it, you cannot stay stationary. You literally must change your physical vantage point.
But the source material introduces a necessary friction to this process. You don't just passively absorb a broader horizon by sitting by a hotel pool drinking a margarita.
No, you definitely don't. John brings up culture shock.
Right. He uses the example of completely failing to navigate the Tokyo subway system for 3 days.
And he frames that anxiety and confusion not as a failure of the trip, but as the very mechanism of growth.
From a neurological standpoint, I mean, that makes perfect sense. In your home environment, your brain operates on absolute autopilot.
It has to, just to conserve energy. It understands the social scripts, the transit systems, the language.
But when you drop that brain into Tokyo, every single heuristic fails.
The cognitive dissonance is staggering. The brain frantically tries to map old paradigms onto a new environment, and it is met with just a wall of incomprehension.
And that friction forces neuroplasticity. If you never experience that failure of your old paradigms, you aren't actually rewiring anything.
Exactly. You're just carrying your home environment with you to a different zip code.
Which perfectly explains the behavioral shift we see in travelers at this stage.
Right, because once a traveler realizes that the dopamine hit of travel comes from successfully overcoming that cognitive dissonance, they start actively seeking out the friction.
They no longer want the prepackaged trip. They want to go off the beaten track.
Emma talks about explicitly ignoring the guidebooks to find a tiny, obscure local restaurant.
Because the beaten track is safe. It is frictionless, it has English menus and predictable service.
But because it has no friction, it offers no culture shock and therefore no horizon broadening potential.
So the traveler transitions from a passive consumer into an active seeker of raw experience. They want the unedited reality of the destination.
And when they finally decipher the menu at that hidden restaurant without help, the psychological reward is massive.
And the instructors refer to this reward cycle as catching the travel bug.
Yeah, they describe it as a positive addiction to continuous travel, where you are already planning the next 3 trips before the first one even ends.
But I really have to question the use of the word positive here.
Oh, for sure.
I mean, we are using the language of contagion, a bug, a virus. I'd argue it operates more like a benign virus that permanently alters your behavioral DNA.
That's a very vivid way to put it.
Right, because once you get a taste of navigating true cultural friction, you build a tolerance to it. You need a heavier dose next time.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, I honestly wouldn't call it benign at all.
Really? Why not?
Because that entirely innocent internal desire for psychological growth might feel positive to the individual, but it scales catastrophically.
Oh, I see what you mean, the sheer number.
Yes. The traveler genuinely wants to broaden their horizons by finding authentic spaces off the beaten track. But when you apply the language of contagion to a global population of billions,
the travel bug becomes a literal plague on infrastructure.
Exactly. And this is the massive pivot in the source material's vocabulary. We leave the realm of personal psychological grief and we crash headfirst into macro-sociology.
The C1 and C2 summit levels. Because if millions of people are all simultaneously infected with this travel bug and they all collectively decide that the beaten track is insufficient for their personal growth,
the hidden gems just don't stand a chance.
They really don't. We enter the realm of over-tourism.
The instructors define this as the point where the sheer volume of visitors begins to critically degrade the local environment, historical sites, and just the fundamental quality of life for residents.
They point to Venice and Barcelona in the lesson, right?
Yes, specifically those two.
Yeah.
But the underlying mechanics are what really matter here.
Emma specifically links this not just to a vague desire to travel, but to the unchecked exponential growth of budget airlines.
Let's look at the actual mechanism there. We discussed how the modern traveler isolates the journey as the miserable part of the experience that must be minimized.
Right, they want to skip the travel part and just get to the trip.
But budget airlines capitalized on that exact psychology. They democratized the journey by making it astonishingly cheap and fast.
Stripping it of all romance and turning it into a hyper-efficient logistical bridge.
But the problem is, they only optimized one side of the equation.
What do you mean?
Well, a budget airline can scale up its flight routes based on consumer demand in a matter of months, right?
Sure, just buy more planes, add more routes.
But the city of Venice cannot scale its medieval plumbing system. Barcelona cannot magically widen its 15th century alleyways.
Wow, yeah. You have hyper-elastic transport mechanisms feeding into hyper-inelastic civic infrastructure.
Exactly. And the economic mismatch is just as destructive.
Because a weekend visitor arriving on a $40 budget flight doesn't pay municipal taxes.
Right, yet they disproportionately burden the trash collection, the public transit, and the emergency services.
So the local resident is essentially subsidizing the infrastructure for an endless rotating door of transients. Transients who are only there to extract an experience.
Which just accelerates the next concept the instructors introduce.
Yeah.
The commodification of culture.
Right. When a destination is subjected to that volume of extractive demand, the cultural fabric just hollows out entirely.
Sacred traditions, religious ceremonies, or generational art forms are stripped of their internal meaning.
And repackaged as cheap commodities for visual consumption. Basically just content for Instagram.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. I want to ask you about the concept of authenticity here, because it feels like a moving target.
It definitely is.
The traveler abandons the beaten track specifically to find an authentic experience. But if a local community is only performing a sacred dance because a tour group paid a premium to watch it, does it lose all original meaning?
That is the million-dollar question. Is authenticity even a tangible reality anymore? Or is it just a marketing buzzword we use to establish a hierarchy among travelers?
This raises an important question because I'd argue it acts entirely as a status symbol now.
Oh, 100%. To prove you're a better traveler than the tourist next to you.
Exactly. What we're really dealing with is a sociological equivalent to the observer effect in quantum mechanics.
The observer effect. Okay, break that down for me.
So the mere act of observing a phenomenon changes the phenomenon. Imagine a traveler wanders into a quiet residential neighborhood.
Right, far away from the main square.
They see a local cafe where residents are just going about their daily lives. It is authentic because it exists independently of the tourist gaze.
But the moment the traveler observes it, values it as an authentic hidden gem, and broadcasts it.
They post the geotag on social media to prove their status as an explorer.
Precisely. And that broadcast acts as a flare. The algorithm directs thousands of other travelers, all seeking that same friction and authenticity to those exact coordinates.
The source material calls this the paradox of authenticity. The very act of discovering and validating an authentic space guarantees its destruction.
I think about the timeline of that local cafe. It's so predictable, right? First, the backpackers show up.
Then the guidebooks include it.
Yep. Then the landlord realizes the foot traffic has increased and doubles the rent. The original cafe owner can't afford it and gets evicted.
And in its place, an investor opens an overpriced aesthetic matcha bar that explicitly caters to the aesthetic demands of the tourist.
The culture is completely hollowed out, but the physical shell remains.
We demand authenticity, but our economic footprint ensures we will only ever receive a curated performance.
The locals are caught in an impossible bind, honestly. They are forced to perform caricatures of their own heritage to capture the tourist dollars they now rely on.
But because the sheer volume of visitors has displaced all other traditional industries.
It is incredibly grim when you really look at it. You realize that your personal quest for horizon broadening is actually an act of cultural erasure.
But the vocabulary progression doesn't stop there.
No, it gets even deeper. Because the modern traveler has realized that a 2-week vacation isn't enough to achieve true immersion anymore.
Right, they want to merge the concept of travel with their actual lives, completely blurring the line between work and escape.
Which brings us to the apex of the C2 terminology, and arguably the most complex ethical debate in the entire curriculum.
The digital nomad dilemma.
Yes. The instructors define a digital nomad as someone who works remotely from a laptop, continuously moving between countries.
Usually earning a high-tier Western salary while living in an economy with a much lower cost of living.
In the cultural zeitgeist, this is framed as the ultimate victory over the drudgery of modern life.
Oh, totally. You have severed the geographical anchor of the office. You are perpetually off the beaten track.
You are living the travel bug as a permanent state of being.
But John analyzes the macroeconomic reality of this lifestyle in the lesson, and it is devastating for the host nations.
Because the digital nomad relies heavily on a mechanism called geo-arbitrage.
Exactly. You are earning dollars or euros, but you are spending in pesos or baht.
And while that feels like a harmless life hack for the individual nomad, like, oh, look how cheap my rent is at scale, it triggers rapid, aggressive gentrification.
Let's trace the causal chain of that gentrification, just to be clear.
Let's do it.
So a neighborhood in Lisbon or Mexico City is targeted by digital nomads because it is deemed authentic and highly affordable.
Right. A local landlord is currently renting an apartment to a local family for, let's say, the equivalent of $500 a month.
But then a remote tech worker from San Francisco arrives, and they are thrilled to pay $1,500 a month for that exact same apartment.
Because back home, that space would cost $4,000.
The landlord evicts the local family. I mean, why wouldn't they?
Exactly. The financial incentive is just overwhelming. You can't even blame the landlord in that system.
But the ripple effect doesn't stop at housing. As the density of nomads increases, the local commercial ecosystem adapts to the new influx of capital.
The neighborhood grocery store that sold affordable staples is suddenly replaced by a boutique selling imported organic goods.
The laundromat becomes a co-working space with high-speed internet.
The original inhabitants are literally priced out of their own geography.
The very people who built the culture, who gave the neighborhood the authenticity that attracted the nomads in the first place, are displaced to the margins of the city.
Facing longer commutes and fractured communities, it's just tragic.
And this requires us to look critically at the romanticization of the word nomad.
I am so glad you brought that up, because the hijacking of that word is staggering to me.
It really is.
Yeah.
Historically, indigenous nomadic populations moved in response to ecological cycles.
They moved to survive. Crucially, they moved in a way that allowed the landscape to regenerate behind them.
They lived in profound symbiosis with their environment.
Whereas the modern digital nomad operates in a purely extractive capacity.
They do not move with the seasons. They move with the strength of the Wi-Fi and the weakness of the local currency.
They carry an incredibly heavy, disruptive economic footprint, but they bear absolutely none of the long-term civic responsibilities of a permanent resident.
Are they explorers, or are they just a decentralized, modern iteration of economic colonizers?
Wow, that's a heavy question. But it fits, doesn't it? They aren't arriving with military force to extract spices or gold.
No, they're extracting vibe, authenticity, and cheap living.
But the result, the displacement of vulnerable populations, is eerily similar.
It forces us to recognize that mobility is not a neutral act.
Right.
The ability to cross borders freely, to bypass the friction of immigration that local populations face, and to inject a dominant currency into a fragile housing market is a profound exercise of privilege.
The digital nomad is an active, often destructive participant in reshaping the global economy, even if their individual intentions are completely benign.
It is a staggering realization. Let's just pause and look at the sheer distance this linguistic roadmap has covered.
Yeah, let's take a breath, because Emma and John started this lesson by teaching us the polite way to use the verb to book when organizing a simple trip.
Right, just booking a hotel. And by following the logical progression of that vocabulary, we ended up at the absolute bleeding edge of sociological theory.
Dissecting the ethics of geo-arbitrage and the displacement of indigenous populations.
As John points out in the transcript, mastering this advanced vocabulary doesn't just help you pass a language exam. It builds an absolute fortress of fluency.
If you can articulate the mechanics of overtourism or the paradox of authenticity, you are no longer just making small talk about a vacation.
No, you are participating in high-level debates about globalization, human psychology, and urban economics.
Because the words we choose dictate the reality we perceive.
Exactly. When we evolve from the simplistic concept of a trip to the nuanced reality of gentrification, we lift the veil on the true cost of our wanderlust.
We are forced to acknowledge our complicity in the systems we use to escape our daily lives.
And that brings us to the end of the roadmap.
But it is not the end of the conversation. In the source material, Emma actually gives her students a piece of homework, and I want to pose it directly to you listening to this right now.
Oh, this is a great exercise.
I want you to brutally examine your own travel habits. When you plan your next escape, what are you actually optimizing for?
Do you prefer the safety, the predictability, and the lack of friction on the beaten track?
Or do you relentlessly seek out the culture shock and validation of the hidden gem?
And there is no easy absolution here. Both paths carry profound consequences.
Staying on the beaten track feeds the hyper-concentrated destruction of overtourism in places like Venice.
But seeking the unedited authenticity of the hidden gem accelerates the paradox of authenticity, paving the way for eventual gentrification.
It is a massive ethical burden to carry in your carry-on luggage. To synthesize the massive amount of ground we've covered today, we started by analyzing the psychological walls we build between the romantic ideal of travel, the consumer product of the trip, and the quarantine suffering of the journey.
We explored the desperate kinetic momentum of the B1 vocabulary, where the need to get away reveals our reliance on global mobility as a coping mechanism for modern burnout.
We then analyzed the neurology of the traveler, looking at how the cognitive dissonance of culture shock is the required friction to truly broaden our horizons.
We discussed how the dopamine reward of overcoming that friction creates the travel bug.
And finally, we confronted the macroeconomic reality of what happens when that bug infects billions.
We traced the causal chain from budget airlines to over-tourism, examined the commodification of culture driven by the observer effect, and dissected the ethical minefield of digital nomads displacing local populations through geo-arbitrage.
It is a brilliant synthesis of linguistics and sociology. It demands that we recognize that every time we log into a booking ledger and step onto an airplane, we are engaging with a deeply flawed, highly extractive global ecosystem.
It really changes how you look at a simple vocabulary list, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. Which leaves me with one final thought for you to mull over as we conclude this deep dive.
Lay it on them.
The source material has proven that our current vocabulary dictates our understanding of movement. Our words shape our economic actions.
Right.
But if our current language concepts like getting away, finding hidden gems, and living like a local inevitably leads us down a path to cultural erasure and gentrification, what new concepts do we desperately need to invent?
That's the real challenge.
How do we describe a more ethical, symbiotic way of existing in someone else's home? If the very machinery of the trip is broken, what would a truly post-tourist vocabulary even sound like?